I am delighted to welcome our panellists, Shadia Hancock, wave Shadia, Jennifer Lowe, Beth Radolski, and Jane Hancock. So our first topic that people asked lots of questions about was subject outlines. So the subject outline is probably the most important document for understanding the content and requirements for a subject. Panellists, what information is currently missing from subject outlines that would be helpful for autistic students?
Thanks, Sandra. For me, when I was doing my undergrad, I used the subject outline as like my everything, my Bible, because it just gave me context to what I was learning and why. And then I would often use that in conjunction with the lecture slides each week, and then in conjunction with the textbook readings and any other additional readings that were required. So I know for some of my non-autistic peers at university, and I wasn't diagnosed at the time, so this is obviously all in hindsight, I know other people found it useful in and of itself, but for me, I needed a lot more context around, okay, if this is the learning outcome, which chapter of the textbook, which lecture, and then for the exam, what is it within that space that I need to focus on? So I guess my short answer is a little bit more context would be really helpful.
Shadia?
So I guess as a current student, I echo a lot of what Jennifer just said. I rely on subject outlines quite a lot, particularly before uni begins, and also knowing whether there are particular assessments that I need to contact my lecturers about regarding adjustments. I guess I've needed additional guidance regarding what tasks are required every week. In my first year of uni, I would read every required reading every week until my course coordinator said it was just a guide and you don't need to do that. And it caused me a lot of stress not knowing what was required. And sometimes I don't know what textbooks are going to be made available online. You know, they usually give a reference list, but sometimes I need further guidance on, you know, which textbooks I really, really need, as opposed to just getting every single one listed on the reference list.
Great. Thank you. So still on the subject of subject outlines, what types of supports would be useful to you in understanding and navigating the subject outline? And related to that, when would that support be beneficial? So if you're trying to navigate your subject outline, is it when you're choosing subjects that you really need that help? Is it before the first lecture, or is it at multiple points during the semester? Beth?
Thanks. So I think in my experience, one of the things that can be a struggle in navigating the learning guide is the broad scope of how many different things you're learning across the span of a semester. So one of the things that I find really, really helpful for myself as a student, also now as a teacher as well, is supporting students to identify a narrower area of interest that they can kind of hyper-focus on within the subject, and ensure that every week they're contributing a little building block that they can then focus their assessment. So I did humanities, and we may have studied a subject on diversity, and you might study gender and race and sexuality and all these different things. And I found it helpful to say, this is going to be my focus for the semester. I'm going to link every assessment question and argument to this specific scope, and I'm going to read for meaning for that. So if there's any way to indicate that in the subject guide, that what are you going to be assessed on, how widely do you need to read, or do you need to read deeply into certain areas and demonstrate your learning, that type of thing can be really helpful.
Great, thank you. So subject outlines, obviously, just summing that up, there's a lot more information that could be in there that would be really helpful, and also help with navigating it. And I know students have also raised with us in the past that having access to those when choosing subjects would be really, really helpful, because it does help them get a sense of what sorts of assessment tasks, what's the flow of the unit, and can help them avoid subjects that are going to be problematic. So moving on from subject outlines, assessment tasks. One of the things we know is that autistic students often struggle to understand assignment rubrics, particularly with words that to neurotypical folks seem to be really meaningful, like realistic or clear or excellent, and we're lost. So as students, how have you been supported, or how would you like to be supported in navigating those rubrics? And how can lecturers make sure that their wording is actually inclusive of literal thinking and autistic students who have difficulty interpreting those instructions? Jennifer.
This question actually made me laugh. It wasn't until I started teaching at university and marking others' assessments, other students' assessments, that we were given a teacher's version of the rubric, and it broke down into further detail. For this category of mark, it means that there needs to be between 2 and 5 references, and for this category, it needs to be between 5 and 10. And I thought to myself, where was this my entire undergrad degree? It would have been great to know when it says, good use of references versus fantastic use of references. Well, what is good and what is fantastic? And having that sort of behind the scenes view, it just made me realize how much concrete information was missing and would have been really helpful. And so I always made a point, with my tutorials when I ran them, to say to students, these are the metrics that we're looking for, and everyone sort of breathed this, sigh of relief, whether they were autistic or not, to say, okay, that's great. Like I can now achieve that. So even as the marker of assessments using rubrics, I would have to break it down for myself and then would pass it on to my class. So I think that those more concrete categories are really helpful.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. Shadia?
Yeah, so I've really struggled with this throughout my life, not just at university, but even in VCE and particularly during exams. And I guess the best things for me have been when they've given real world examples of, whether it's finished products from a previous year or a simulation done by teachers, or about what a pass looks like or what a credit looks like. And I guess for me, that support's been really helpful ongoing, not just in my first and second year of university. I guess as well, like Jennifer said, you want to make it really clear how the grades differ. So when I look at good versus excellent, I don't exactly know what it means. But then when I reach out to lecturers and ask, they might go, well, realistic means that, when you're in a therapy context in my degree, you need to be able to implement it without it being too costly, and that there's time, available for that resource. And how's that more appropriate than other ones? So once that was broken down for me, that made a lot more sense. So I think it's just being able to be really specific and make sure and check in with students that they're understanding, and even knowing things like, an HD looks like you going beyond just the prescribed resources and looking at very high quality research articles. That's been really helpful. So yeah, that's my main points.
I was just going to echo, really, from point of view of having done postgraduate studies myself, and then from the point of view of being a secondary school teacher and looking at what happens with our autistic students in the secondary context, where just reiterating the importance of making things very explicit, because wherever there's a need to read between the lines, I mean, for me, I just hit inertia, so I would be stuck. If there was any ambiguity, I would just stuck. What we find with some of our students in exams and things like that is that there'll be a question, it might have 5 or 6 marks attributed to it, it might have 9 lines, and the student will provide 2 words, and in their eyes they've answered the question. So it's even in the way that the questions themselves can be structured, so that it's really leading the student through what's required. And as Jennifer pointed out, I think it was Jennifer that pointed out that it's not just your autistic students that are going to benefit, everyone will benefit from that.
Thank you, Jane. And I know I'm not supposed to speak as the facilitator. I'm supposed to just facilitate. But I just wanted to give an example, really concrete example of that, of a student who was doing really, really well all through semester and then got a fail grade for their exam. And when we spoke to the marker afterwards, they said, well, they didn't do section C and D of the exam. Like, they missed 2 whole sections. They only did section A and B. And I know how the brain works, because this is the way my brain would work. And I said, well, can I hazard a guess that in section B, the instruction was answer one of the following questions? Yes, that's right. They had a choice. Did it say answer one of the following questions and then proceed to section C? No, because they would know that. That's the type of thing that seems really simple but will get us every time. So, just echoing what the panellists have said, that those really clear, explicit instructions are so important. So a lot of subjects have a requirement for oral presentations, which I know autistic students find very challenging. What types of adjustments, as you've been going through your studies, what types of adjustments have teaching staff made for you, or could they make for you, to assist you in meeting requirements for oral presentations? Beth.
This is one of my favorite questions about accessible assessments, because I think lots of people struggle with presentations, but oftentimes it can disproportionately impact autistic students, because body language can be so different in autistic culture in particular. So I think one of the things to be mindful of, and I'm a sociologist, so I try to sort of take a cultural and social approach to understanding discrimination and disability and neurodiversity. But I think one of the things to be mindful of would be unconscious bias and your neurotypical understandings of what communication and body language means. So oftentimes you might have a student who's fidgeting. You might notice that I'm rocking back and forth, and you may interpret that as the student's nervous. And unconsciously you might think they must have done this last night, they must not be prepared, whereas that student's actually really enthusiastic and switched on, and they're stimming because they're very intellectually switched on to what they're doing, and that's how they're processing that or communicating that to you. So I think being mindful of unconscious bias is important, and not applying neurotypical communication norms to autistic people. And then also applying that in the rubric as well, because oftentimes what you see in a rubric is stand still at the front of the room, uses an engaging tone of voice. That pretty much puts the onus on the autistic person to mask or pass as neurotypical to excel in their presentation, which is a sort of indirect form of discrimination in the rubric and grading criteria. So I'd encourage you to be mindful of differences in communication, and think of it like cross-cultural communication. You want to make it accessible for everybody.
Terrific. Thank you, Beth. Shadia.
Actually, Beth, your points are really interesting, because I reflect throughout my schooling, and all of the comments on my oral presentation has been, your speech rate's been too fast, your voice is too monotonous, you're not making enough eye contact, when I thought I'd done a really good job. And what I've realised is it's just the way that I communicate. And even on the rated PowerPoints, I've gotten the same feedback, like, you weren't engaging enough. And I went, to me, I was speaking clearly and doing all the things that I thought I was meant to do. But it's interesting when you reflect on, oh yeah, that's a common theme. So it's really validating for myself to know that it's actually just a difference. I guess for me, group presentations are just a nightmare for me. So during placement, sometimes, I've had discussions with my supervisor beforehand about adjustments, and we've come to agreements of me doing one on my own with maybe a bit more research, or doing it with a smaller group or a pair as opposed to a larger group. I think for me, having the opportunity to do pre-recordings is much easier because I can take my time with my processing. My processing's slower than, I guess, non-autistic people. So when it's in a live format, it can look really obvious, and people might put that down to me being anxious or me forgetting things. And so when it's timed, it's really difficult for me to keep up. There was one oral presentation I had to do, and I only had 10 minutes, and it was really difficult for me to get through it. And then the feedback was, sorry, that's my dog. The feedback was you spoke too fast, you could have been more engaging. And I thought, well, it's hard for me to do multitask, all these different, keep the information in my head with the cognitive load side of things. Then also have to consciously think about how I'm coming across to non-autistic people. So it's definitely something to keep in mind, that we do have communication differences.
Thank you, Shadia. I have to say, one of my favourite autistic presenters always presents with his back to the audience, and presents beautifully, and is so articulate, and you turn him around to face the audience and it's a completely different experience. So I think, just that recognition of differences and diversity. Moving on, still sort of on the topic of assignments, providing feedback. So students have commented that as they progress through their course, feedback on assessment tasks becomes more general. So an assumption that, in first year you need very clear and concise feedback, and then by second year we just say that was good and you're supposed to know what that means. What types of feedback best support your learning style as an autistic student?
I guess for me, I guess sometimes there's this assumption that when we progress through, even when I think about high school, you're just a thumbs up or a thumbs down's enough. I'm someone who likes to apply my learnings and know exactly what needs to change to be better, and know what to do next time if I'm in a similar situation. So I think when I get comments, for example, going, this wasn't detailed enough, I like to know why wasn't it detailed enough? What would have distinguished between a credit and a distinction response? And I think being able to provide opportunities to discuss this with a tutor or a lecturer in more detail would be helpful, because sometimes I look at the assignments and I go, I'm not really sure how to apply this learning ongoing. So I guess being able to be really specific in what, so some of the examples that I've had is that really good response, in order to get an HD, you could expand on, home practice, or perhaps citing a few more articles, or you forgot to add this reference in. Those are really specific examples that give me a clear idea of, okay, so next time I need to include more information about why I chose this particular technique, or why, how am I going to communicate this to the client. So I think, as we've said before, being explicit and specific is really important. And for me, that's an ongoing thing that needs to be made explicit. I don't just grow out of my autism after 3 years. It's something I constantly need support with.
I'll just echo that, Shadia, about not growing out of our autism, because I'm a lot older than Shadia, and I have a son who's a university student, and he brings home his feedback, and it says things like, really great, but you could have gone into more detail. And he says to me, how would I do that within the word count? And I'm lost. I can't answer him. I still couldn't do that. Jane?
Speaking personally, as a bit like you, Sandra, even from an adult learner perspective, and even after having done, various different courses, postgraduate and all that, and then being a teacher, I still have trouble with sledgehammer kind of feedback. I think I take the points. I think it's really important to be specific. But certainly with the students I teach in secondary, I always try to give it a, I mean, you don't want to be Pollyanna about it. You want to be real about it, but there's a way of delivering the message. I think autistic people can be very hard on themselves, and I find that, you know, it doesn't take much to deflate some of our autistic young people. I don't know that it necessarily changes all that much when we get older. So I think the way you deliver the message can also be helpful. And I think by, as the speakers have already said, by providing some specific details that can soften the blow sometimes, because we can tend often to be quite perfectionist, and anything that's not perfection is considered failure. So yeah, that would be my input there.
Thank you, Jane. You've kind of hinted at our next question, which was, that was really helpful. How can autistic students with perfectionism and fear of failure be supported when receiving feedback? So you've certainly given us a view, particularly as a teacher, but some of our students who are currently receiving feedback, would be interesting to hear from your perspective. Jennifer?
So currently finishing off my PhD, but also reflecting back on my experiences, perfectionism and fear of failure are certainly something that I identify with. And I think that there is a tendency to, you know, I remember, just as an example, one of my PhD lecturers for a PhD topic, I approached them afterwards to ask about a mark I had received, and the approach was almost the opposite of what I wanted or needed. So I was looking for really like honest, constructive, specific feedback about, you know, okay, like it is what it is. How can I improve for next time? And it was sort of like, well, you know, you got a distinction, like what more do you want type. And it was this sort of almost, you know, you don't need to feel this way. It's like someone telling you relax when you're stressed, like it's just not going to happen. This is how I'm feeling. So I suppose having that, I don't know if it's compassion or understanding that, you know, it's not that perfectionism or fear of failure needs to be wrapped in cotton wool. It's actually quite the opposite in my experience. And so just to be able to say quite factually, these are the things that could be improved, and like a lot of the other panelists have said already, making that detailed.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. I just had a private message in the chat from one of our autistic PhD graduates who reminded me that when he was finishing his PhD and the supervisors said it was brilliant and everyone who read it said it was brilliant, and it went to examiners and it took longer than he thought to come back, and he was crushed. It's going to be, I've failed abysmally, and that's why they're not coming back. You know, I'm going to have to rewrite the whole thing. He was so anxious and so stressed. Got his PhD awarded summa cum laude from both examiners. So, you know, we can get really, really anxious waiting for feedback and receiving feedback. Shadia, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I guess as well, I always dread getting feedback because I never know what to expect. I know that even in the past with even the subjects at high school that I was really good at, I would oscillate between a pass and a fail all the time, because if the expectations were not made clear to me, I would not be able to demonstrate what was necessary for the task. So one of my teachers was actually really surprised how literally I'd taken the instructions, and she said, I need to be checking in on you every week pretty much to make sure you're on track. And I think being able to have that context is really important, and being able to, I guess, I find it really difficult asking peers for feedback as well, because what I've found is that I don't know if the rest of the panelists have found this, but with non-autistic peers, they tend to be very hesitant to provide honest feedback. And then that when I've provided feedback, I've kind of gone in with a sledgehammer and done all the pros and cons, and then alienated myself from everyone else, whereas some people do rely on that collaboration. Sometimes I find it really difficult to connect to peers in that way. So maybe I guess some of the things that my tutors have done in the past is, saying this is something that could be expanded on, or, in order to get this result, this is what you need to include. I find wording like this lacks, or I don't get this, it's really jarring to me reading that, because, to me, I put in a lot of effort and I've tried my best to kind of understand the other person's, what the other person might be reading, and then just saying, oh, well, I don't get this, it's almost dismissive to me, and I often get quite upset about it. So I think it's just being aware of how we might be interpreting that feedback, and being able to also acknowledge, yes, you put in a lot of effort, overall you're doing well on the course, but this is just something to keep in mind, as you progress, or, in your future job, or that sort of thing.
Great, thank you. We touched on this a little bit earlier, but we're going to drill down into it now, which is the topic of group work. Why is it that group work is so problematic for many autistic students, and what could teaching staff do to make group work less daunting for you? Assuming you have to do group work, how could they make it less daunting? Beth?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that can certainly help with group work is to ensure that there is actually a structure in place for the group, because I think one of the things that can be really difficult is dividing up the responsibilities and ensuring that it's equitable, and then also having accountability where the whole group is held accountable for the actions of every other person and are graded on the basis of every other person's work. So I think one of the things that I saw done that actually worked quite well was to have a contract and to actually give time in class for the group to work through the contract, select which roles lined up with their perceived academic strengths, and then ensure that each group was held responsible for their role within that contract. So I would certainly recommend something like that, just to make sure it's a bit more structured and less ad hoc.
Great, thank you, Beth. So Jane and then Shadia.
Yeah, look, I think Beth's, I agree completely with what Beth said there. I think it's about structure. I love the idea of a kind of a contract situation. I remember years ago when I was working as a tutor at another university, I was in night classes with adults, and I was called in urgently to the adjacent room. The tutor there was having a problem. There were two adults almost coming to blows, one male, one female. And that was group work that sort of got them to that place. I think, again, it's the structure, but I think sometimes it's assumed that people, whether they're, well, mainstream, let's say even, that they know how to do group work. Sometimes it's assumed that it's taught at secondary because you're getting students feeding in from secondary. Well, it's case by case. It depends on where they've gone to school and how much preparation or explicit teaching they've had around that. I really believe that it needs to be explicitly taught. I think that there needs to be some sort of session on what group work involves and the protocols around it, because I'm sure many of us have been in meetings where people don't seem to really understand the protocols either. And that's a real world situation that's not in the classroom, where not all players are understanding, the rules around interacting. So, I think as much structure as possible, and I think that would help to alleviate the common problems, which are, some people doing all the work and then other people signing off on it, or conversely, some people just taking over, and for autistic individuals to try then to figure out, well, what do you do with that? I think if it's structured at the beginning, if you've done the pre-teaching explicitly beforehand, that can be helpful.
Great, thank you, Jane. And Shadia?
Just expanding on what's just been said, something that worked really well in it was an online pair allocation, and what they did was we had to take minutes and document what was covered every session, and both of us had to submit it separately. And it meant that we had to have really clear goals from minute one. And it's also part of professional practice anyway to be able to document and minute what we're doing and stay accountable. So I guess it's not just, some contracts I've come across have just been signatures or, I'll do this bit. But the problem is if you're not having that weekly accountability, people might change at the last minute, or they might, drop off the face of the earth and then appear a few days before the assignment is due and then expect everything to come together. I think something else that's probably good to keep in mind is there an alternate assignment that can be made available if a group dissolves or if there's an issue that arises. And I think having private check-ins with all groups before the due date to figure out are there issues that are coming up would be helpful, because sometimes I've been in situations where by the time I've realised there's a problem, it's been too late, and then once I've raised it, it's kind of gone, oh, well, the assignment's submitted, we can't do anything. So I think for me that's been very upsetting, because I don't always know how to necessarily navigate the dynamics, and also working with unfamiliar people is really difficult for me, particularly if there's already pre-existing connections with the other people. By processing differences as well, as I talked about with oral presentations, it also means that to keep up with the group collaboration stuff is really difficult. Something that's helped me is being able to have a shared document that I can write my ideas down on, but the verbal stuff can take its toll over time. And I think another thing that I've noticed over the years is that some people just have different expectations regarding how well they want to do in the assignment. So, and even the knowledge base. So I've sometimes gone, oh, let's meet up, and they've gone, no, we don't need to meet up that much, it's fine. And it's resulted in a grade where I have not been as happy with the outcome, whereas they couldn't care less, basically. And I think that's a universal issue. I don't think it's necessarily related to just being autistic. Pretty much all of my non-autistic friends hate group work as well in an academic context. But I think when you already are disadvantaged socially and have those communication difficulties within a group with non-autistic people, it can make it really stressful. And for me, if I have multiple group assignments in one semester, I'm just exhausted by the end of it, having to navigate it all. So it's just something to be aware of.
Great, thank you, Shadi. A number of our panellists have made some really good suggestions there in relation to group work. So I will just give them an opportunity if you have any other suggestions. So this is sort of a question for our panel, but it's also a bit of a takeaway question for some of our audience as well. Is alternative assignments that could be supportive of autistic students but still meet the subject outcomes? So are there other creative ways you could assess the same things without expecting an autistic student to work in a group of strangers who speak a different language? Jennifer?
I don't know that this is answering that question directly, but just building on what Jane and Shadia have already said, the mismatch between people's expectations of what they would like to achieve, I find, is quite a common thing among, uni students, autistic or not. And I remember going into a group work situation and someone said, oh, let's look at the rubric and P's get the degrees. And I just thought, oh no, I just had this sinking feeling of I was aiming for a HD. And then, I become that person that Jane spoke about that, sort of becomes the, oh, let me read that before we submit it type thing. And so managing that component is difficult. And then also, the reliance on social media and, WhatsApp groups and, everyone's like, oh, let's meet on Friday at the pub to discuss this. And I just think, oh, really? Can we, move it to somewhere quiet or somewhere with a desk or, so just, I guess, those basics. But in terms of having an alternative, one of the things that, again, I didn't come across until I was in the position of being the tutor was the option to let people group themselves based on the mark they wanted. And so it was like, this table is if you are looking for a credit, this table is if you're looking for a HD. And it was really successful. It worked for the people that were in my tute. So yeah, just thought I would add that.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. And Beth.
Yeah, so just the question about what might alternative assessments look like. I think one of the things that can be very successful is taking a sort of strengths-based approach and allowing autistic people to choose presentation and multimedia formats that line up with particular niche interests as well. So for example, if you have a group presentation and the goal is to communicate to an audience, you could say, you know, get creative. Maybe you can do a YouTube style video, maybe you can do a podcast, maybe you can do a TikTok series, something that assesses all of the same intended learning outcomes and skill sets, but also provides skills that are going to be relevant in a workplace as well, because it's not just oral presentations in workplaces. We are, depending on our careers, going to have lots of different opportunities to communicate in different ways. So I would encourage you to allow for a focus on the intended learning outcome far more so than the method of delivery, if that makes sense.
That's great. Thank you, Beth. And Shadia?
I wish that I had classes like Jennifer's. Can you come and be my tutor? I love my tutors, by the way, but I think being able to have conversations prior to the semester starting has been really helpful for me, being able to discuss my concerns. And sometimes what we've done is I've been able to have a look at all the students in my class that I might be grouped with and gone, oh, I prefer that one, or no, don't do that one, and oh, that one tends to align more with my academic goals. So sometimes that's been really good, because what I find happens is that when there's group allocations and everyone's allowed to just pick whatever they want, I'm the one that's left out, and then I'm left with strangers that I don't know. That's been the story of my life since primary school. So either have it randomized or allow us to pre-allocate beforehand. So, you know, we've reached out to students in the past going, can I join you, you know, can Charlie join your group, blah, 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 which has been really helpful. I think being able to have the option, as I really like Beth's idea of using different types of media to express your ideas. I really love that idea. And yeah, just being able to have other formats to express what we need to. I find that for myself, I do enjoy practical opportunities. So is there a way to still maybe explain our ideas to tutors, maybe in a smaller, more private context? I mean, over COVID, that's what has been done, where we've actually done all the simulations online. We might have presented to a peer with the tutor present, and it's been a lot more accessible for me being able to do it in that way, as opposed to standing up in front of 20 students talking about something alongside other students. And I think being online, as Jennifer said, I can't think of anything worse than going out to a pub and having to interact with peers that way. And I'd often get super tired, you know, because often, you know, non-autistic people have no trouble. They actually enjoy social interactions after class, whereas for me, by the time I'd finished class, I was just tired and wanted to go home. And then by the time I met up with peers, I was so brain dead that I didn't really feel like I was contributing much. Whereas when it was online, we had pre-allocated times we'd meet, we'd utilise other formats of communication like the texting groups or Google Documents to track what we were doing, which meant that I felt a bit more equal with my peers, because that's sort of my preferred method of communicating with people. So I think being able to have those options can be really helpful. And even if there's ways, if the assessment is specifically working with other people, can it be in a hurdle task format or a pass fail type format, as opposed to a massive percentage of our unit? Because sometimes I know that for me that causes massive anxiety when I see even just 30% grading and it's a group task and I don't know who I'm going to be paired with and whether we're going to do well. It just adds that overall pressure.
That's a great idea. Thanks, Shadia. Thank you, everyone. So we're moving on to our final topic. I'm keeping my eye on the time here, which is the dreaded exams. So my first question on exams for our panellists: are there any particular types of exam questions that you find particularly problematic as an autistic student?
Well, an interesting one is the use of, and I don't know to what extent this is relevant to the audience, but negatively worded questions, especially when it's multiple choice. It's interesting that, because I went down a rabbit hole, as often does happen, looking at this whole issue of negatively, choose the following which is not an example of. And there was some interesting research that came out of Melbourne Uni in 2017, actually, about negatively worded multiple choice questions. And the surprising thing was that it actually disadvantaged bright students. So some of the brightest students were disadvantaged by these negatively worded questions. And it really didn't help, even though people think it might, to bold or to write in capitals not ahead of the the task, the options that you're supposed to choose. So I think that's one thing. And then I alluded before to I think wording of questions in such a way that it's crystal clear. And I think you've always got to be clear. Well, I know as a teacher, I'm always trying to be clear. What am I testing here? What do I need in order to know that the student has achieved the skill that I want them to achieve, or they're where I want them or need them to be. And so the wording of the question needs to be such that you've got a good chance of getting what you hope for. So as I said before, it really is not uncommon to get 2 words in a five-part question if it hasn't been, structured that way, or even perhaps some sessions leading up to exams where students have an opportunity to actually run through some of these things with lecturers or tutors to prepare them for how to interpret the questions, because otherwise they're going to interpret them literally often.
Thank you, Jane. Shadia.
Just expanding on what Jane said, really. Sometimes as well, I guess when we go to uni, it's kind of, I don't know whether it's assumed that because a lot of us have gone through BCE or schooling that we've gotten used to the questions that might be asked, particularly at closed book exams. I know that for myself, I still struggle when I have a question like, please choose this approach and explain why this would be good. I find that really difficult because I don't know what level of detail to go into with no more context. Some of the questions I like are list 3 examples or list at least 2 references to support your, in the context of an open book exam, for example. But when I haven't had prior practice with those questions, and it's really difficult for me to know how much detail to go into, and there have been situations in my exams where I've spent half an hour on one question and gone to the end and not finished because I haven't known when to stop. So I think something that's been really helpful in one of my subjects this semester has been being able to have drop-in sessions beforehand. I wish there were more of them because I find it really helpful. Even if I don't ask questions, knowing what the other students are asking gives me a kind of idea of, oh, this is what I need to prioritise. And even there was a written document that was given that said this is the example question, have a go at writing, and then they had the example response underneath and saying this is what you need to include. So not just evidence-based. For example, you might say you need to include, what research supports this particular idea, why it's suitable for this client, and a really clear example of what will lose the mark, such as unsupported statements or therapies, for example, that are not supported in research. Like being really, really specific, I think would be helpful for any student. so that's sort of my stance on exam questions. I find that I do much better on the multi-choice, apart from the not questions or the ones that go, which one of these is not correct? But then the short answer ones, sometimes I'm going, and the marks at the bottom sometimes don't help me either, knowing how much detail to go into.
I totally agree with you. I've always thought all exams should say how many words we want in response to this and how long you should spend on it. Would be really helpful, wouldn't it? So just finishing off on exams, what supports would be helpful to you as an autistic student in preparing and revising for exams? You've mentioned drop-in sessions, but is there anything else, anything specific supports that would help? Jennifer?
I know that there are quite often at the end of a semester, there are, like a tutorial that's dedicated to we're going to be preparing for the exam, or the last lecture is about preparing for the exam. Often the cues or the hints that are provided are not explicit. And so I would still walk away thinking, well, what part, what part of the textbook, or, was there a wink that I missed, or a nod of the head, or, some sort of, nonverbal cue that I missed. So I think that for me, in preparing and revising, understanding which chapters of the textbook or which lectures pertain to the exam. So if learning outcome, 1, 2 and 3 are related to chapters 4, 5 and 6, I think that level of, even though it's really brief, it's still better than nothing. And I remember someone saying to me once, do you actually read the whole textbook from start to finish? And I was like, well, yeah, don't you? Like, to me, it was very obvious, because how are you supposed to know? And then, over time, I learned how to navigate that. But in revising for exams, I know that there is this balance between, not giving it away and making sure that the person is doing the work. But for someone who's going to read a whole textbook, narrowing 15 chapters down to 7 chapters, like, even that's helpful.
Terrific. Thank you, Jennifer. And Shadia?
Yep, totally agree with everything you said, Jennifer. I remember, Mum will remember that. Well, Jane's my mother, by the way, if you hadn't worked it out with our matching surnames. But I just started in my biology, my first VCE subject, and Mum was going, why are you highlighting the whole thing? And I said, I have to read every one of the textbook, don't I? And she went, no. You don't have to read everything. I had to be taught how to summarize, because all I was doing was copying and pasting the textbook's contents into my OneNote. So I think for me, being able to prioritize what information is really, really important is really still a struggle. So, some people think, yay, open book exams, they're great. I'm in the situation now where I've got basically 100 research articles I'm having to sift through, because I am now having to narrow down, because I've struggled to know what's going to be important. And something that I've become aware of actually is that a lot of non-autistic people talk to each other about what sort of information is necessary and things like that, but I don't have that same network. So whereas, other people might go, okay, well, they've said that, for example, this topic's going to be, introduced. I'll just get about 5 articles. I just go, I'm going to look at the references at all of my lectures and get everything from there, and then go forward. And then I have to then pare back all of the time I've spent, collating all these resources. So often by the end of the semester, my notes are an absolute mess. So I think it's something that's been good is that sometimes lecturers have actually put stars, or, this will be important for your exam on particular slides. So then when I go back at the end of the semester, I can go, oh, this lecture is really important, or this particular tutorial helped practice for a simulation I have to do. So that sort of explicit, it doesn't have to be necessarily this is what will be on the exam, but even those sort of little hints for me, visually I can see it, whereas as I think, was it Sandra or Jennifer said that, I miss the non-verbal cues that a teacher might be going, look at this exam, it needs to be made explicit.
Great, thank you. And final point from Jane?
Just very quickly, I don't want to take too long, but I think carefully worded questions go a long way, like very carefully constructed questions. But then certainly at secondary, we find it helpful to unpack task words, explore, clarify, expand, all of those sorts of things. And it's probably, good to sort of bear in mind that regardless of intellect, people on the spectrum tend to have problems with executive functioning, and executive functioning, takes in a lot of things. And one of those can be, prioritising and kind of intuiting which things are going to be important to the person who's actually written this question for me. Because, you've got to kind of jump in the shoes of the other person in a way. So when I'm constructing questions for my students, I try to keep that in mind, that that's hard for them.
So just the first question was what, as professional and academic staff, what considerations or should we keep in mind when supporting autistic students to do placements?
I'm currently going through placements, so I guess I can share what I've been through. I've got a really good placement coordinator, and we've pretty much been in contact since year one. I think it's really important to have communication with the student. I think what's been really helpful is being able to meet with my supervisors prior to starting placement and being able to discuss what I find challenging and what I'll need further support with. So when I did placement last year, we had weekly one-on-one meetings prior to the placement starting. And I also discussed things like, usually there's group feedback given, for example, in placements. I really struggled with that. I didn't like it. So she said, that's fine, I'll give you feedback privately. Those sort of little things were really helpful for me. When going on external placement, some of the things that I found helpful was being able to have prior notice of where I might be sent to, and also being closer to home, given that the travel aspect can be anxiety inducing in itself. And I guess as well, being able to know how much support I can receive on those external placements. So, knowing what I can and can't access, and then, whether it's, once a week I go in as opposed to a huge 2-week block. Those sorts of conversations happening early, I think, can be really helpful. And then being able to share my education inclusion plan and seeing, what sorts of things can be adjusted in line with that, were all conversations I actually had prior to even beginning my uni degree. Yeah.
I just wanted to add to that from another student who I had a lot of interaction with about 2 years ago, who was a nursing student who was doing really, really well with all their assignments and failing their placements. And that was the feedback they were getting was things like she doesn't smile at all the patients, she doesn't chat with the other nurses. She's, so I would say one of the things in preparing for placements is I would also be preparing whoever the placement is with for making sure that they know enough about autistic students, so that they're understanding that if they've got an autistic student who's doing a wonderful job in the placement but isn't having coffee with the other people and isn't smiling at all of the clients, that they shouldn't get marked down for that. So I think, I would add that. So thank you, everyone, and I look forward to seeing you all next time.